break since I was. Come on. Still haven't captured the screen yet, have I? I had it just a second ago. I don't know what happened to it. There we go.
The story is set in a very obscure land that's far away from Israel, Uz. The main...
Okay, Uz. How'd you like to live in Uz? That's kind of like living in Who'da Thunk It, right? Yeah. Anybody know anything about Job? Who was he? Where did he come from? What time was he?
It seems like he was during the patriarchal period, but I think our book put him in a different time period, though.
Yeah. I don't think he was in the chronological Bible in that chronology right there. There's only one hint that I know of in the whole book that tells us where he was at least after. And that is that one of his friends was a Temanite. And the city of Teman was built by one of Esau's sons in Idumea. So I'm kind of figuring that it had to be after Abraham, after Esau, but there's no other hint anywhere in the book as to when it is. And I think that he'll point out that that's probably intentional because he doesn't want us worrying about when and where and everything. The story itself is what he wants us concentrating on.
Do you think another possible clue would be that he was sacrificing for his children himself rather than at the temple?
Well, I think it's clear he's not an Israelite. Right. So he says he's a man of the East, which would probably mean he's one of the descendants of Abraham's other sons, or Ishmael. Ishmael, or the other sons from Keturah, because they formed all of the Arab nations on the Arabian Peninsula. So that's all we can determine from it. So let's do, I'm going to stop this every once in a while and ask a couple of questions because there are a few places that I think he's kind of strayed off a little bit, but that's just my opinion. We'll talk about that and see what you think, okay? So this, if you haven't seen the Bible Project Doodles, this is one of the best teaching tools I've ever seen. If in the right hands, this is a mighty powerful instrument for learning. Okay.
Character Job, he's not even an Israelite, and the author, who's anonymous, doesn't even set the story in any simply on the story of Job and on the questions raised by his experience of suffering. The book of Job has a very clear literary design. It opens and closes with a short narrative prologue and then an epilogue. And then the central body of the book is dense Hebrew poetry, representing conversations between Job and 4 dialogue partners called the Friends. These conversations are then concluded by a series of poetic speeches given by God to Job. Let's dive in and we'll just see how it works together. The prologue introduces us to Job, and we're told that he's a blameless, upright man who honors God. He's a super good guy. And then all of a sudden, we're transported into the heavenly realms, and God is holding court with his staff team. It's a very common image in the Old Testament describing how God runs the world. And among the heavenly beings is a figure called the Satan, which in Hebrew means the accuser or the prosecutor. And it's like we're watching a court scene. God presents Job as a truly righteous man, and then the accuser challenges God's policy of rewarding righteous people like Job. He says, the only reason Job obeys you is because because you bless him with prosperity. Let Job suffer, then we'll see how righteous he actually is. And then God agrees to let the accuser inflict suffering on Job. Now, it's at this point in the story that most of us go, what? Why did God do that? And then we assume that this book is going to answer that question, why God allows good people to suffer. But as you read on, the book doesn't answer that question. Nothing in the book ever answers that question. The prologue is setting...
Okay, I want to talk about that for just a minute. How many of you, if I ask the question, is there evil in heaven, would you say yes or no? What? No?
In the heavenly places.
Well, what happens to a noun when you put ly on it? It becomes an adjective, or it could be an adverb, but the noun is heaven. And when you put ly on it, it becomes an adjective of or having to do with heaven. So here's a scene. Huh?
Satan was up there.
Yeah, I mean, there's...
Don't know quite where.
Well, it's where the throne of God is, according to the story here. And is this the only place that we find that that's the case? Or is there any other place that says there is evil in heaven? Because what we're actually talking about is the spiritual realm where God dwells. He is a spirit and dwells in the heavenly. Satan is also in the heavenly. It doesn't mean they're in the same room, but they're in the same realm, the same dimension, if you will. And Ephesians chapter 6 is very clear that our struggle is not against the world, it's against the spiritual forces of wickedness there. And here, Satan is bantering with God. Anybody remember where the story of Peter and the Lord says to Peter, Satan has demanded permission. That almost sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? He has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. There is communication between God and Satan. There's communication here between God and Satan. Satan is a part of the spirit world and will be until all enemies are put at Jesus' feet. And that's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 or 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through the end of the chapter. Don't get the idea that the spirit world is free of evil at this moment. It will be purged, but it is not yet. So when he's talking here, when the story of Job is being played out, let's get the full picture. Let's understand what is actually being said here and what's at stake. So I'll stop it again in a few minutes and we'll talk about it, what comes up later.
The real questions this book is trying to get at. Questions about God's justice and whether God operates the universe according to the strict principle of justice. And the response to those questions comes as you read through to the end of the book, not at the beginning. The ultimate reason for Job's suffering is simply never revealed. So the prologue concludes with a suffering and bewildered Job who's rebuked by his wife, and he's approached by three friends who are going to try and provide wisdom and counsel. Their names are Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, and Zophar, the Naamathite. They're all non-Israelites like Job. And they represent the best of ancient Near Eastern thinking about God and suffering.
Eliphaz. Anybody tell me what that, any of you that have a literal word, put your finger on Eliphaz and tell me what his name means. Now the other names are not connected, but Eliphaz is, in a way. Tell me what his name means, because that's a Hebrew name. Anybody got it? My God is gold. That you can tell from Hebrew names when their name has something to do with God, because it will begin or end with L, or it will begin with J-A or end with A-H. And all of those names are going to describe something about God, like Daniel. Daniel is the name Dan that was given to one of the sons of Jacob. And the mother gave him that name because she says, I've been vindicated by God. I think it's a positive name. Yeah. Usually when they use, huh?
It's not implying that he worships gold.
No, I think he means that his God is the most precious. No, I don't. That would be a real strange use of L in their culture anyway. Of course, there are some strange names like Nabal. How in the world did a guy get the name Nabal, which means fool? Did mom and dad give him that name? Well, it just doesn't make a lick of sense to me. That seems like it's an earned name from later on, and we know that there are people that got names changed because of activity and things that they've done. But there's another one coming along, one of Job's friends, Elihu, and we're going to look at his name too when we get there. So pay attention to names. They always have some bearing on the story.
In the human condition, and this moves us into the main part of the book. First, Job speaks. And this is how this section of the book works. First, Job is going to speak, and then they'll follow a response from a friend. Then Job will respond to that friend. Then another friend will respond to Job's response, and so on, back and forth, for 3 cycles. And this whole debate is focused on 3 questions. Is God truly just in character? And does God run the universe on the strict principle of justice? And if so, then how is Job's suffering to be explained? As we're going to see, Job and the friends, they're working from a huge assumption about what God's justice ought to look like in the world. Namely, that every single thing that happens in the universe should operate according to the strict principle of justice. So if you're a wise, good person and you honor God, good things will happen to you. God will reward you. But if you're evil and stupid and do sinful things, bad things will happen to you. God will punish you. Now,
Anybody know of a New Testament passage or story that illustrates that concept right there that permeated the world from the time of Abraham, or maybe even before, all the way through the blind man? You remember what the question that the disciples asked was? He's blind. Who sinned, him or his mother? Well, he's born blind. That kind of makes you wonder about their question, you know. But that's been the concept, that God doesn't let anything bad happen to people who are good. The story is going to shed light on that and us making judgment about God because of things that happen to people. You ever heard anybody say, I can't believe in a God that would let that happen? The book of Job deals with that.
Job's constant argument throughout his speeches is this. First of all, that he's innocent, and so the implication of that is that his suffering is not a divine punishment. Now we know from the prologue, both of these things are true. Remember, God himself said, Job is righteous and blameless. And so Job concludes his argument by accusing God. God either doesn't run the world according to justice, or even worse, God himself is simply unjust. The friends, on the other hand,
pardon me for interrupting, but he makes assumptions here himself when he says Job accuses God. Because I'd like for you to read the passages that deal with him, what he says is accusing God. And Job is asking questions. And sometimes the questions are very long, and at the end of it, he will say, if not, then... So he's wondering. And he's asking these questions because he doesn't get it. He's been a good guy all of his life, tried the best that he can try, and these things still happen to him, and he's got his so-called friends accusing him. Every one of them said he had to have done something evil or God wouldn't have let this happen. So that's what Job is facing, and it is troubling to him that he can't get anyone to listen to his case. Well, yeah. She says, why don't you curse God and die? That's some help from the better half. Bitter half? Yeah.
They beg to differ. Their argument is that God is just, the implication being that God always runs the world according to justice in this way. And so they conclude by accusing not God, but Job. Job must have done something really, really bad for God to punish him like this. They even start making up possible sins that Job must have committed. Job protests to all of this. In fact, he gets so fed up with the friends that he eventually just gives up on them. He takes up his case directly with God. Now, something to be aware of is that Job, he's on an emotional roller coaster in these poems. He used to think that God is just, but now he can't reconcile that with his suffering. And so in some outbursts, Job, he'll accuse God of being a bully. Once he even declares that God has orchestrated all the injustice in the world. But the moment he utters that thought, he's terrified of it because he wants to hope and believe that God is truly just. Job is all over the place in this section. And so he makes one last statement of his innocence, and then he demands that God show up personally to explain himself. Now, it's at this point that a surprise friend shows up, Elihu the Buzite. Now, he's not an Israelite, but he does have...
Elihu. Somebody give me the meaning of that man's name. Because it starts with L, and it's the kind of name that Hebrews always used. They were very fond of putting God in their name somewhere. Huh? He is my God. So, though he's not genetically a Hebrew, he believes in the same God. Give me some examples of people who were not Hebrew that believed in God. Well, I mean in the Old Testament here. Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a priest of God Most High, and he reigned in Salem, which became the place, and Noah. Yeah, the priest of Midian. He was a priest of God Most High. What's another one? Another prophet that started out as a prophet of God, but he kind of went haywire. Huh? No. Huh? Balaam. He was from somewhere over toward Babylon, somewhere from the east, but he was a priest of God, but he didn't act like it. So there were a lot of others that were faithful to God, and that's really what we have here with Job. Is a man from the east, not an Israelite, but he's an example for everyone because God said there's nobody like him on the earth. He's really good.
Hebrew name. And Elihu, he has the same assumption as Job and the friends. He argues that God is just and that implies that God always operates the universe according to justice. But then Elihu draws a more sophisticated conclusion about why good people suffer. It may not be punishment for sin in the past. God might inflict suffering as a warning to help people avoid sin in the future. Or God might use pain and suffering to build character or to teach people valuable lessons. Elihu doesn't claim to know why Job is suffering, but one thing he is certain of. Job is wrong to accuse God of being unjust. Job doesn't even respond to Elihu, and the dialogues come to a close. It's like the wisdom of the ancients has been spent, and the mystery remains. And then, all of a sudden, God shows up in a whirlwind, and he responds to Job personally. He first responds to Job's accusation that he's unjust and incompetent at running the universe. So God takes Job on a virtual tour of the universe, and he starts asking him all these questions about the order and origins of the cosmos. Was Job ever around when God architected the earth or organized the constellations? Has Job ever commanded the sunrise or controlled the weather? God has his eyes on all of these cosmic details that Job has never even conceived of. Then God starts going into detail describing the grazing habits of mountain goats and how deer give birth, or the feeding patterns of lions and wild donkeys. What's the point of all this? Remember the assumption of Job and his friends about what it looks like for God to run the world according to justice. Underneath that assumption is a deeper one, that Job and his friends have a wide enough perspective on life to make such a claim about how God ought to run the world. And
How God ought to run the world. That is the key to understanding this whole book, because, and it's one of the reasons why we have instruction in the Bible. Remember when Paul was before the council in Acts 22, and he said, I've lived my life with a perfectly good conscience to this day. And the high priest said, slap that man. And Paul said, God will slap you, you whitewashed wall. And so then they jumped on Paul because he had spoken evil of the high priest. And Paul said, I didn't know he was the high priest. I'm not sure what he meant by that. If he was sitting where he was supposed to be sitting, there's no question about whether he might have been saying, I don't think you have any right to be the high priest. That might be what he was saying. But anyway, the rule was, don't speak evil of a ruler of the people. You remember how many people got swallowed up because they were commenting Korah, the rebellion of Korah, and it almost happened with Aaron and Miriam. So it's a very serious thing when we start speaking evil of something we don't know all the facts about. And that's exactly what we have here, and the point that God is going to make to Job and his four friends. Do you have a clue as to what I go through in ruling the universe? Were you there when I made all of this? Do you have the wisdom to put all this together so it all works like it's supposed to work? So that's the question, and that's why it's really good if we kind of hold back on our vitriol about world leaders. And I don't particularly like the activities that go on in Washington, but I am not about to call somebody a fool, because I might not know everything about what's going on. Just might not.
God's response with this virtual tour, it deconstructs all of these assumptions. It first of all shows that the universe is a vast, complex place, and that God has his eyes on all of it, every detail. Job, on the other hand, has only the small horizon of his life experience to draw from. His view of the world is very limited. And so what looks like divine injustice, from Job's point of view, needs to be seen in an infinitely larger context. Job is simply not in a position to make such a huge accusation about God. After the virtual tour, God asks Job if he would like to micromanage the world for a day, according to the strict principle of justice that Job and his friends assume, punishing every evil deed of every person at every moment with precise retribution. The fact is that carrying out justice in a world like ours, it's extremely complex. It's never black and white, like Job and the friends seem to think. Which leads to God's last point. He starts describing these two fantastic creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, which some people think are poetic depictions of a hippo and a crocodile, but more likely they refer to well-known creatures from ancient Near Eastern mythology that are used elsewhere in the Bible as symbols of the disorder and danger that exist in God's good world. These creatures, they're not evil. God's actually quite proud of them, but they're not safe either. The point is that God's world is amazing and very good, but it's not perfect or always safe. God's world has order and beauty, but it's also wild and sometimes dangerous, just like these two fantastic creatures. And so we come back to the big question of Job's suffering. Why is there suffering in God's world? Whether it's from earthquakes or wild animals or from other humans, God doesn't explain why. What he says is that we live in an extremely complex, amazing world that at this stage, at least, is not designed to prevent suffering. And that's God's response. Job challenged God's justice. God responds that Job doesn't have sufficient knowledge about our universe to make such a claim. Job demanded a full explanation from God, and what God asked Job for is trust in his wisdom and character. And so, Job responds with humility and repentance. He apologizes for accusing God, and he acknowledges that he's overstepped his bounds. Then all of a sudden, the book concludes with a short epilogue. First, God says that the friends were wrong, that their ideas about God's justice were just too simple, not true to the complexity of the world or God's wisdom. And then God says that Job has spoken rightly about him. Now, this is surprising because it can't apply to everything Job said. I mean, we know Job drew hasty and wrong conclusions, but God still approves of Job's wrestling, how Job came honestly before God with all of his emotion and pain and simply wanted to talk to God himself. And God says that's the right way to process through all of this, through the struggle of prayer. The book concludes with Job having his health, his family, his wealth all restored, not as a reward for good behavior, but simply as a generous gift from God, and that's the end of the book. So the book of Job, it doesn't unlock the puzzle of why bad things happen to good people. Rather, it does invite us to trust God's wisdom when we do encounter suffering, rather than try and figure out the reasons for it. When we search for reasons, we tend to either simplify God like the friends, or like Job, accuse God, but based on limited evidence. And so the book is inviting us to honestly bring our pain and our grief to God and to trust that God actually cares and that he knows what he's doing. And that's what the book of Job is all about.
Okay, I got a few questions. How would you explain hardship? How does God made so many promises to the Israelites when they went into the land? If you do this, I'll do this, and if you do that, I'll do this, and it was all based on what they did, and God's reaction to that was always, "You're going to be wonderful." What is different now? Why is that not necessarily the case now? And actually, it wasn't even then. But we got to figure out why. Why were the prophets, almost every one of them, killed? Unjustly killed. Why didn't God protect them instead of letting them be killed? Just to give you an example. Isaiah preached during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, and the bad guy. Anybody remember what his name was? Huh? No. Manasseh, yeah. The bad guy, my hero, yeah. Now, he was about as good a prophet as there ever was. You might say Elijah was better, and Elijah was taken up instead of dying, but Isaiah lived a long time and suffered a lot in order to be God's prophet. And finally, Manasseh either had him tied between posts and pulled tight and then sawn in two, or he was drawn and quartered with horses. The history is kind of unclear. That's a horrible death, to be sawn in two. Why didn't God stop that? If it's true that sin is why things happen to us, then he was a sinner. That's why it happened to him.
But also you can ask the opposite question, why did, when you put them in the furnace, they didn't burn up?
That was my next question. Good job, Russ. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, by the way, what were their other names? We ought to know their Hebrew names because they didn't even want to be known by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those were names that glorified the Babylonian gods. Remember now, the names that glorified God started with EL or ended with EL or had JH in the front and AH in the back. So what were their names? Hananiah ends in L, so Jehovah is part of that name. Mishael, which has EL at the end of it, and Azariah, again, using Jehovah as part of his name. But their view of what was going to happen to them, because they refused to bow down and praise Nebuchadnezzar when the music played, they said, "O king, you can tell us to do whatever you want to do, but our God whom we serve is able to save us from this furnace of fire, but even if he does not, he will rescue us from your hand." So they viewed death as a rescue. I just have an idea that Isaiah viewed death the same way. What did Paul say about we are what? How are we to look at life? Huh? No, that was James, but that was the brevity of life. I'm talking about what did he say about how we should view our lives? We are being put to death all day long. Every minute of every day, we should recognize that our lives might be sacrificed for the cause of Christ, but in that sacrifice, it will be a rescue because we believe in a resurrection. We believe that when we leave this world and we're resurrected with Christ, that it's a whole new ballgame. Now, that's what I think we should learn from all of this, that trust God no matter what the circumstances are. Because this life is not what determines the beauty of that. It's where we go when this life is over. And there's so many cases of people sacrificing their lives for something they really believe in because they know God will not let them down. Job had trouble understanding that because the thinking of the day was that if I do something wrong, I'm going to suffer pain and agony for it. And that's what everybody thought. Just about every society believed that sinfulness, it's karma. It's the big wheel of life. What goes around comes around, and you're going to get run over by that big wheel of life if you do the wrong thing. What other examples can we use that would help us to see this principle? I had a thought that this whole thing fits the picture of the Messiah. Because nothing in his life deserved the punishment that the problems that came upon him. They were in spite of his goodness. And everything that the Lord did was as a sacrifice, trusting in God to make it all okay later. Look up and wait. Wait. Anybody else have any comments? Yeah, Dick. And you read the passages that, if you get this and you look at those passages where he says he accused God, you look at it and see if you think he was actually accusing God or just, I can't figure this out. I think that's what it was. So I'm a firm believer that everything that we have in the scriptures is to help us to understand how God thinks. And that, when you look at the first two chapters, the chapters where Satan is approaching the throne of God with all of the other princes, and if you want to know about princes, read in Daniel 9 and 10 about the angelic forces, and a whole lot of them in Daniel are opposed to God instead of supporting God. As a matter of fact, the angel that was there with Daniel, he says, the prince of Persia has been withstanding me for 21 days, and I have no one here to help me except Michael, your prince, and the prince of Greece is about to come. And I mean, all of these princes were over nations or influencing nations that were opposed to God. But what we don't seem to be able to picture is that even though someone is opposed to God doesn't mean they're not accomplishing the will of God, because that's what he said. The prince of Persia, God called him by name in Jeremiah. The prince of, he said, my servant Cyrus is going to bring my people out. So even though it wasn't the intent of the king, and the prince of Persia was leading them in opposition to God, thinking that they were going to do what God didn't want done, it actually turned out to be the thing that God did want. I've got a book that I'm trying to find time to read, and the title scares me, and the thought of it scares me, but I want to see what the author is saying, because there are elements of it that kind of make sense to me, and that is, the title of it is God's Devil. I read that and it kind of, that gives me goosebumps. But the thought that he is making is that no matter what Satan does, no matter what turn Satan makes against the will of God, he's actually fulfilling the will of God, because somehow it fits into this chess game between the devil and God to save those of us who are willing to turn back to him. That's the whole thing about all of this, is finding people who are willing to turn around, willing to come back. The whole plan is based on that. It's why Jesus, coming into the world, was going to be a Job. Nobody could understand that. Nobody could understand that a king was going to come and he was going to save his people by dying. No king saves his people by dying. That's ridiculous. Until it was, until it happened. And still most people don't believe it. So let's trust God in everything, no matter what happens to us. I'll tell you what, I gave up a long time ago trying to figure out why things are happening. Yeah. Pardon me? It's by I think he's a Baptist named Lutzer. Yeah. Is that what you said? I couldn't hear you. Have you read it? Oh, did you? Should I read the book or should I not? There are some thoughts there that I want to understand, things that I really don't understand about how God does things. I'm with Job. I look at the world and the way it works, and I think, how in the world can that possibly be right, you know? How does God allow 50 million children in our country to be aborted.
I think in some ways God expects us to question on certain things.
Well, I mean, you can see that in the book of Job because he doesn't condemn Job for his questions. And that's why I think that Job never did actually accuse God. The questions that he asked sounded somewhat like accusations until you get down to the, if that's not the case, then what? Yeah, Michelle? Yeah, still it doesn't make it. You know, it doesn't make sense to me because if we go out and kill a person, we stand in judgment for it. Even if we hate them and would kill them, we stand in judgment. So God does not appreciate that, and I know that's the case. Job was clean of all of that, and yet he was suffering these accusations, and all of these things happened to him. And the devil is using his right as the accuser. That's what I want to understand. And I want to know if that book, if he has some insight into that I can use, how that fits in God's plan that we suffer. Paul made that statement. I can't remember, it's in Romans, I know, but I can't remember where. We are being put to death all day long. We're as sheep to be slaughtered. We are part of God's army willing to die for the cause. There's not a soldier in our army that doesn't agree to put themselves in harm's way. That's what that means. I'm willing to die for my country. Romans 8, okay. Yeah, Russ.
I wonder what the Apostle John thought when he was in exile, and he probably knew that all the other apostles died a martyr's death. He probably was questioning, God, why did they have to die a martyr's death and I don't get to?
Well, don't get to, yeah. Well, he was standing there when the Lord said, if I want him to live until I come back, what's it to you, Peter? So, I mean, we don't understand. We don't understand how we have to stay longer. We don't understand why we have to leave early. That's all part of a master plan that, like was told to Job and his friends. Were you here when I created the world? Nuh-uh. Well, then don't question me. You don't have the perspective to question me. That's so hard to do when I want to be the ruler of my domain. I want to know why. Well, son, you don't need to know why. Just do what I tell you.
Do you think that Satan thought he had one up on God when he presented the Job situation?
Oh, I think so,
And
yeah.
God just outfoxed him and put into one of the best lessons anywhere in the Bible for us.
Yeah.
About having faith, and Satan probably thought, I'll get you on this one.
I think so. I don't know how he cannot have learned by now, being an unbelievably powerful being with intellect that probably goes way far beyond anything we are combined. designed to tell us, trust God, just trust God. And the fact that he starts off the book by telling us ahead of time that Job was a righteous man, upright in every way, and I'm losing my... Uh-oh.
Good thing you got a new one.
Yeah.
Let me go get it.
Oh, well.
So that's how Noah was described too.
Yeah, there have been times when people were so different from the rest of the world that God didn't let anything happen to them. But in the case of Noah, man, you talk about suffering. Being opposed to the rest of the whole world for 120 years, ridiculed by everybody, preaching to everybody and nobody listening, and then being part of the 8 people that are saved. I ran across, so what I can tell you I am mic'd up now. Well, it's working.
It's working now.
Well, we do to some degree. You know, I mean, if we could picture our intellect and what happened at the time of Babel, for instance, when they were building a tower, and what they were trying to do was ridiculous. Let's build a tower to heaven and take over. Oh, come on. Bunch of doofuses. That's not going to work. But they didn't know that wasn't going to work. But the point that God made from that was that if they are able to communicate, every one of them, combine all of their intellect together, nothing will be impossible for them. I don't think that's just rhetoric. I think that's a reality that we have bits and pieces of the intellect of God, and when everybody works together, look at what this country alone could do back in the 60s when we put a man on the moon, men on the moon. That is unbelievable. We'd have a hard time doing that again today because I don't think we can get that kind of cooperation again today. But God said, unless we go down and confuse their languages so that they can't communicate, nothing will be impossible for them. So I do believe that we have way more intellect than we know how to use. And it's a dangerous thing. Like you said, this is a dangerous world that we live in. And we need to understand the dangers of it. And that's a good thing, good reason to come to these seminars that we're going to have, because we're facing a very, very dangerous world now. And human intellect is creating problems for us that we got to be aware of. Might be. Let's have a word of prayer. Tom, would you lead us in prayer? one last thing I'd like to say about Job. I want you to consider what an honor it was for him to go through what he went through. God said he's